This is the third in our four-part series on Job. Last week I spoke about the ways in which I think from the book of Job we can see how to respond to people who are struggling, who are suffering, and we don't know how to help them. But one of the big questions we have when we're going through hard times, when we're struggling, when we're suffering, is a question that keeps coming up in the book of Job. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today and next week in the last sermon in the series. The big question that comes up and we ask ourselves is, what is God doing? What is God doing in Job's situation? What's God doing in the situations where we're struggling and we're suffering? And this is fundamentally a question that Job keeps asking during the book is, where is God? Why is God doing this? Where is he? One of the challenges, I think, of going through difficult times, going through struggles and suffering, is that they remove from us an awareness of God's presence. We feel like God isn't with us anymore. Job is constantly complaining about this throughout the book. In chapter 23, the whole of chapter 23 is Job essentially saying God is absent. God is not here. In 29 verse 2, he says, "How I long for the months gone by, for the days when God watched over me." When we go through difficult times, when we suffer, we often feel it's because God has stopped watching over me. That's how Job felt. God stopped watching over me. He was watching over me before when everything was going well, and now it's going hard. God stopped watching over me. Psalm 42, verse 9, "Why have you forgotten me?" says the psalmist. This is how we feel when we're struggling, when we're going through hard times. God has forgotten me. God is absent. God is not watching over me. Fred Craddock tells the story of a minister he knew in New York, a church minister who had been born with no arms. And as he grew up, his mum cared and looked after him. She did everything for him. And he said that one day, his mum came into his room with his clothes and threw his clothes on the floor and said, "Get dressed." And he'd never dressed himself before. And he said, "I can't dress myself." And she said, "Well, you're going to have to." And she just walked out. And he said he kicked and he screamed and he shouted out, "You don't love me anymore." And then he realized his mum wasn't coming back. And he thought, well, if I'm going to get any clothes on, I've got to do it myself. And he said it took him hours just to get some clothes on. But he said what he didn't know at the time, what he didn't find out till later, was all through that, his mum was just in the room next door crying. And Fred Craddock finishes the story by saying, "I don't know if God distances himself from us, but sometimes we feel some distance." And I think that's what Job is talking about. This is what Job feels. This is how we feel when times are hard, when times are struggling. We feel distant from God. But I think the truth of the book of Job is that is all it is. It is just a feeling of distance. We just feel like God is absent. We feel like God isn't there, God isn't listening. The truth of the book of Job, I think, is that God is there. God is there all along. In the first sermon on the series, I talked about how I think Job is about the fact that we don't have any answers. We cannot answer that question. Why do bad things happen to good people? The only answer we can give is, I don't know, because we don't see things from God's perspective. We can't see things from God's perspective. We only have our limited information. And one of the ways in which this limited information affects us is it makes us miss God when he's at work. We can't see what God is doing. We just feel like he's not there. Right at the beginning of the book of Job, you remember Satan came to God and said, God said to Satan, "Have you seen my servant Job? There's no one like him. He's amazing." And Satan says, "Well, of course, he worships you. You've put a hedge around him. You protect him from anything bad happening to him. If you take away that hedge, he'll curse you to your face." And what happens in the story is precisely that. God sort of removes that hedge. But the thing about the book of Job, the thing that Job never knows, never realizes, doesn't understand, is that hedge is never completely taken away. Because God says to Satan, well, you can, all right, do what you want, but don't touch a hair on his head. God sets a boundary straight away. And then when Job continues to hold on to his faith and Satan comes back and God says, did you see Job? You incited me against him, but he still holds on to his faith. And Satan says, well, of course, because I didn't touch him. Let me at him, and then we'll see his true colours. And God says, okay, but do not kill him. God is constantly setting a boundary around Job, even though to Job it feels like there are no boundaries. You feel like God has totally abandoned him. Because we don't always understand what's happening when we're struggling, when we're suffering, the conclusion we come to is that God is doing nothing. God has completely abandoned us. But what we may be experiencing is just we're not aware of the boundaries God has set around us. We feel like God's taken all the boundaries away, but we just don't know that he's still setting the boundaries. He's still protecting us, still caring for us, even as we struggle. It reminds me of what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 10, chapter 13, where he says, no temptation or no testing, no trial has overtaken you except what is common to humanity. Paul's basically saying what you're experiencing right now feels difficult, but it's just part of being human. Everyone experiences things like this. But then Paul goes on to say, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tested beyond what you can bear. Now, it doesn't feel like that when we're going through trials, when we're being tested, when we're going through suffering and difficulty. It doesn't feel like that. But is it in fact true? There's a parallel, I think, in the Gospels as well with something that happens to Peter. In Luke 22, Jesus says to Peter, this is just before Jesus' crucifixion, he says, Peter, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you turn back, strengthen your brothers. We might feel like God is absent, that God is doing nothing when we're going through hard times. That's why we're going through hard times. But we miss that actually he is still at work. Our suffering blinds us to the fact that God is still at work, setting limits to what is happening, putting a hedge around us, interceding for us. As Jesus interceded for Simon, he says, this is going to happen to you, Simon, but I've prayed for you and you're going to be okay. Sometimes we think that because God lets us go through something, rather than taking it away from us, it means God isn't listening to our prayers. God hasn't heard our prayers. But Christ does not pray to spare Peter from the sifting. He says, I've prayed that your faith will not fail. That's what Jesus prayed. And our limited knowledge means that we miss these things. We don't know. And for us, we don't know what limits God has set. We don't know how much worse things could have been if it were not for God and the prayers of others and the intercession of Christ. And Job feels that God has abandoned him, is ignoring him. But I think the way the book unfolds shows that God is actually present and aware of what is happening in every word that's spoken. As we find out at the end of the book, God appears and speaks to Job out of the storm, and it's become clear that God's well aware of what's going on. God is not absent at all. God has been there. He knows what's happening. But Job feels that God is not listening to him. And one of the things I think is really good to remember, very important to remember, is the precise reason that Job is suffering is the exact opposite of this idea that God has forgotten him or God has taken his eyes off him. The reason Job is suffering in the first place because God points him out. God points him out and says, have you seen my servant Job? He kind of brings them into the spotlight. It's not that God has forgotten him. It's not that God doesn't remember him. It's precisely because God does remember him that he is struggling and suffering. What we see in the book of Job is a spiritual conflict, a spiritual battle. And sometimes the reality is our suffering is linked to what's going on spiritually for us at times. There are times where we suffer because we have made bad spiritual choices. We're neglecting our relationship with God. We've sort of given the devil a foothold in our life, and we've opened ourselves up to difficult situations and struggles. But equally, there are times in our lives where we are struggling, where we are suffering, where it is hard because we've made good spiritual decisions, because we are walking with God. And we've become a kind of on the front line of spiritual warfare. We've become a target. Spiritual warfare is a reality. It may not be something we're very conscious of, but it is a reality. If God is at work, the Bible is also keen to tell us that there is someone else at work. If God is trying to establish his kingdom, there is an enemy who is seeking to work against the establishment of God's kingdom. And we can sometimes be on the front line of this battle and find ourselves struggling and suffering precisely because we're involved in the work of building God's kingdom. Sometimes we are discouraged. Sometimes life is just hard. Our relationship with God feels difficult. And sometimes there are those voices that whisper in our ear at this time, this God doesn't love you. If God loved you, this wouldn't be happening. God's forgotten you. God doesn't remember you anymore. But these things sometimes happen because of our faithfulness. And in fact, I am absolutely convinced that the more we do for God, the more fruitful we are with God, the more frequently we will be challenged with that inner voice that says, this is a waste of time. You're not achieving anything. Why are you bothering with this? Sometimes we suffer discouragement. Sometimes we suffer obstacles precisely because we're on the right path. I have said this before in a sermon, but it's a quote that stuck with me. If in your walk in life you never bump into the devil, maybe it's because you're heading in the same direction. And I think this is kind of lived out in the book of Job. The way the world works, the message the world presents is that an easy life is a good life. That's what life is about, an easy, as enjoyable as possible. And I think this is the culture we live in, and that does infect the church. That does infect the church. At the sort of the most obvious level, it infects the church with what we may call the prosperity gospel, the health and wealth movement, the idea that, look, just get your relationship with God right, be obedient, be faithful, and all you will get is good stuff. You'll never be ill, you'll be wealthy and healthy, and all those kind of things. The book of Job is a real problem for that kind of worldview, because Job is obedient, Job is faithful, and yet he loses everything. He is afflicted. Now, I have heard an answer. I had a friend who went to a church that kind of lent towards the prosperity gospel, and what he told me about a sermon he'd heard once that, obviously the preacher knew the book of Job was a problem, but he had found a solution, because in Job chapter 3, when Job first sort of begins to complain, one of the things he says towards the end of his speech is, what I had feared has happened to me. And the preacher's view was, well, there you go. Job had been afraid that this would happen, and so it happened, because he didn't have faith. Job's problem was a lack of faith, and this is why it happened. I don't buy that. I don't think that's consistent with the book. And of course, it's certainly not consistent with the cross. Now, that's kind of the biggest obstacle in many ways to the prosperity gospel. I don't know how you can read the story of Jesus and say, well, if you're obedient to God, you get an easy life. I don't think that follows in Scripture. But even those of us who say, oh, no, I know that. I don't accept that. I reject prosperity teaching. I reject that. Even those of us who hold that can fall into the trap of thinking along these lines, that when life is going well, it means God is blessing us. And when life is hard, something's gone wrong. How many times, our culture loves success and hates failure. And how many times do we find that attitude in the church? Where if we throw an event and it goes well and loads of people are there, we say, well, that's because God has blessed it. Does that mean that if only 2 people show up, God isn't blessing it? Is that what we're saying? Is that what we believe? That, God is only in things that go well. God is only working if it's successful. Is that what we believe? Sometimes the things that God is blessing, sometimes the people that God is closest to are those who are going through a hard time, who are struggling. Things aren't working. Nothing seems to be happening. And to everyone else, it looks like failure. But the reality is, no. That person is walking with God. We don't learn, do we? How many times have we seen Christian men and women, very successful ministries, filling sort of auditoriums, writing best-selling books, and it comes out that they haven't really been walking with Jesus? That there are parts of their life where he is not Lord. Yet every time, well, that person's blessed by God. That person's got a great ministry because it's successful. I read, when I was younger at university, I read a book. I was given a book on my reading list called The Shadow of the Galilean by a German New Testament scholar called Gerd Thiessen. And it was New Testament scholarship, but he was very clever in the way he wrote it, because he wrote it like a story. It's called The Shadow of the Galilean because it's about a Jewish zealot. The zealots were a faction within Judaism who were kind of a terrorist organization, I guess you would say, dedicated to overthrowing the Roman oppression of the Jewish people. And it's a story about a zealot called Andreas, who's arrested by the Romans for taking part in a protest against Pilate. And the Romans sit him down and say, you're in a lot of trouble, but we might be able to work something out. We've been hearing about this Galilean called Jesus, who's going around. We're just curious about what he's up to. And eventually they convince Andreas to report on Jesus. And it's called The Shadow of the Galilean because Andreas always turns up at places after Jesus has left. So he's in Jesus' shadow. He never meets Jesus in the whole book, but it's New Testament scholarship because he turns up at places and he interviews the people who were there and gets their opinion on what Jesus has done and so on. It's a stealthy way of teaching New Testament scholarship. It's an interesting book. But when I first read it, there was a section at the very beginning that sort of buried itself in my mind. Because right at the beginning, Andreas has been arrested and he's been interrogated by a Roman officer. And the Roman officer says, look, I don't understand you Jews, why you hold on to your faith in this God. Look at us, the Romans. We've gone from a city-state to ruling the whole world. Surely that is proof that our gods are stronger than any other gods. And Andreas's reply, I read all those years ago, has stuck with me. Andreas says, in response, he says, all nations think that the gods are on the side of the victors. But we know that the invisible God is sometimes on the side of the losers. And this is what I think we see in the book of Job. Sometimes God is on the side of the losers. And the book of Job should teach us that success is not necessarily proof that God is in something or that God is with you. And equally, hardship, struggles, things not going very well is not proof that God has abandoned you. Is not proof that God is not with you. Sometimes it may be the very opposite. The last thing I wanted to talk about this morning, this is something that I found extremely interesting. I think the book of Job, we see that God is not only present and aware in suffering. God, I think, is actually the only one who truly hears and understands what's going on. We read in chapter 40, we read a section of what Job sees. So God speaks to Job and challenges him about his attitude. And Job says, God, you're right. You're right. I wish I hadn't said anything. But God says, no. He keeps going. He keeps laying into Job and saying, well, you've accused me of all sorts of things. Well, I'm going to challenge you now. What about this? What about that? Poor old Job gets, absolutely hammered. But then we get to Job chapter 42. And we read this really interesting statement where God says, he says it twice. He says to Job's friends, I'm angry with you and your two friends because you have not spoken of me what is right, not like my servant Job. Now, if you read the whole book, this should stand out to you. I think one of the problems sometimes is we read the Bible, we don't really read it. We kind of assume we know what it's saying. This should stand out to you if you read the whole book. We've not read the whole book. Go away and read it if you don't believe me. But this should stand out because God says to Job's friends, you have not spoken of me what is right. But if you look through the book of Job and see what Job's friends have said, it's pretty good. I said this last week. They say some pretty good things. We've heard last week, I talked about how the fact that they condemned Job falsely. They end up accusing Job of all kinds of things, blatantly lying about Job. But God's not angry with them for that. He says, I'm angry with you because you've not spoken the truth about me. What they've said about God is not right. But here are some of the things, just some of the things they've said about God. So Job 8:20, surely God does not reject one who is blameless or strengthen the hands of evildoers. Absolutely, I think we agree with that. That's probably right, isn't it? What about verse 11:7? Can you, Job, they're talking to Job, can you fathom the mysteries of God? Can you probe the limits of the Almighty? Yep, that's good. That's right as well. What about verse 22, verse 2? Can a man be of benefit to God? Can even a wise person benefit him? And all of Job's friends, that this is the kind of stuff they say all through the book. They are basically accusing Job. They are the ones defending God. They are the ones speaking well of God. And yet God says to them, you have not spoken the truth about me. Like my servant Job. Which is quite interesting when God showed up just previously in chapter 40 and says, you've accused me of all kinds of things, Job. In fact, let's look at some of the things Job says about God in the book. Let's start with chapter 9 here. This is Job speaking about God. Even if I summoned him and he responded, I do not believe he would give me a hearing. He would crush me with a storm and multiply my wounds for no reason. That's what Job says about God. Next, chapter 10. Does it please, speaking to God, does it please you to oppress me, to spurn the work of your hands while you smile on the plans of the wicked? This is what Job says about God. Chapter 16. God assails me and tears me in his anger and gnashes his teeth at me. My opponent fastens on me his piercing eyes. Okay? Well, Job 19. Speaking to his friends, says, if indeed you would exalt yourselves above me and use my humiliation against me, then know that God has wronged me and drawn his net around me. So these are some things Job says about God. And yet God says, Job's friends, you've not spoken the truth about me like my servant Job has. How do you make sense of that? How do you fit all those jigsaw puzzles together? I think there's only one possible way you can do that. And that's by suggesting that God judges the truth of our words by something more than whether they are just factually correct. That God is looking for something else when he judges whether or not we are speaking truthfully about him. Now, it is Father's Day. I am a father. One of the things about being a father, I think you just learn so much. It really confronts you with so many challenges. When you're a new father and you've got children who can't look after themselves and you've got to look after them, and they never say thank you because they're just babies, and you have to put yourself second and attend to their needs, you learn a lot. And then as they grow up, and you see them learning to read, and you sort of learn about how to teach and how to help others. And then your children become teenagers, and you learn about how everything in the world is your fault. And, what a terrible job you've done as a parent. And some of you will be very conscious of this, that your children will, Ruth and I, we get blamed for all kinds, even things that are outside of our control. I didn't realize we were so powerful until I had teenage children. But some of us know this. Your children say things to you that are just not true. They tell you they hate you. Some of you know that and what that feels like. And as a parent, one of the best skills I've ever learned, one of the best skills I've ever adopted is trying not to listen to my children's words and trying to listen to their heart. Trying to listen to what is behind the words. Because sometimes your child will say they hate you or you've ruined their life and they're just being spoiled and a brat. But sometimes they will say they hate you and you've ruined their life, and what they're really saying is, I am hurting right now. And this skill has saved my sanity. And I learned this skill from God, because I absolutely believe this is how God listens to us. He filters our words through our hearts. He responds to our hearts rather than whether our words are factually accurate or not. Something is happening here in the book of Job. There is a truth that goes beyond the words mentioned to the hearts. And Job's heart is found to be the sort of heart that God delights in. And this shouldn't surprise us, because at the beginning of the book, this is what we're told. Job is a righteous man. He is a good man. He is an obedient man. God is proud of him. All through the book, Job is he doesn't feel like he needs to justify himself to his friends. He's constantly saying, if only God would listen to me. If only I could stand before God and plead my case. He's saying, I want to defend myself before God because God knows the truth. God knows I am innocent. God knows my heart. By contrast, Job's friends may speak many things that appear to be true, that sound true about God, but their hearts are not oriented towards God. Their hearts are not, as we know, even oriented towards their friend Job, who is suffering. Their hearts are oriented towards being right. That's what they're concerned about. Job's faith is in God. Job's friends' faith is in their arguments, their worldview, their conviction of their own self-righteousness. And God hears their words through the filter of their hearts and can say to Job's friends, you did not speak truthfully about me, unlike my servant Job. I think sometimes when we are struggling, when we are suffering, we give voice to our pain. And sometimes we say things that we think, I can't believe I said that. Sometimes we say things that might make people around us feel uncomfortable when we're talking about God. But know this, know that God never feels uncomfortable with what you're saying. Know that God filters your words through your heart. Make sure your heart is right with God, and let that be the truth of your relationship with him rather than what you say. And equally, be aware that you can stand and say all kinds of truthful and good things about God. You can stand here and sing the words we sing every Sunday, but if your heart is not oriented towards him, he will actually come to you and say, you have not spoken the truth about me. Be afraid of speaking of God if your heart is not right with him. But if your heart is right with him, be afraid of nothing. Don't be afraid of bringing your pain to him. He will never hold it against you. I think the book of Job shows us that God does not forget us, does not abandon us, though sometimes we feel like he has, but that's not the truth of it. God is at the heart of what is happening. He is aware, he is carrying, hearing us in a way that no one else does. If you get your heart right with him, desire him, seek righteousness, and that is the filter through which God views your response to trials and sufferings. And that, in the end, is what brings you through it.